People are never going to forget. The problem is, do we have any power? What do we do? What do you do? You definitely can change the way you vote, like if it comes up again. But the problem is, this is a bipartisan issue.
It's bipartisan.
Certainly not a hoax if Ghislaine Maxwell's in jail, too. She's in jail for sex trafficking. But the question is, to who? Who's she in jail? You have to be sex trafficking to somebody in order to go to jail, right?
Yeah.
So who? How's that work?
Never stop asking questions. And you have tons of power. You're Joe Rogan. Hi again, everybody. It's now 5 o'clock in the East. On the scale of momentous and impossible to ignore, Joe Rogan reminding his millions of listeners that they can, quote, change the people they vote for, is a clear sign that Joe Rogan is not going to become Lindsey Graham in this story. He's refusing to buy the BS being peddled by the Trump White House and rescue Donald Trump from a crisis of his own making, his botched handling of the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. The scandal has proven to be sticky and a critical flashpoint and growing political nightmare for Donald Trump and his entire administration, as well as Republicans in Congress who, in a sign of weakness, decided to tell everyone they were leaving Washington to go home to hide from the Epstein scandal. Now it is the subject of a significant brand new court ruling that broke late today. The judge overseeing the Epstein case saying he will not unseal the grand jury transcripts and exhibits, rejecting a request by Donald Trump in his bid to appear transparent and quell this political firestorm, bipartisan backlash to his handling of it. In his ruling, Judge Richard Berman writes this today, quote, a significant and compelling reason to reject the government's position in this litigation is that the government has already undertaken a comprehensive investigation into the Epstein case and, not surprisingly, has assembled a, quote, trove of Epstein documents, interviews, and exhibits. And the government committed that it would share its Epstein investigation materials with the public, end quote. Judge Berman also writes this, quote, the information contained in the Epstein grand jury transcripts pales in comparison to the Epstein investigation information and materials in the hands of the Department of Justice. The government is the logical party to make comprehensive disclosure to the public of the Epstein files. By comparison, the instant grand jury motion appears to be a diversion from the breadth and scope of the Epstein files in the government's possession. Judge Berman's ruling coming one day after the Republican chairman of the House Oversight Committee announced his committee intends to release Epstein investigation records to the public, which the Justice Department is expected to begin sharing with members on Friday. As the questions pile up, so too does the political peril for Republicans who could be forced into a vote next month that the New York Times says will, quote, thrust them into a political thorny position between Trump and constituents, with a timetable that, quote, all but guarantees that the issue would hang over lawmakers throughout the August recess and that Republican leaders would be forced to address it when they return. That is where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Voting rights attorney and founder of Democracy Docket, Marc Elias, is here. Plus, former acting assistant attorney general for national security at the Justice Department, Mary McCord, is here. And MSNBC senior contributing editor Michelle Norris is here. Marc Elias, it is something I came to late, but something I now cover enthusiastically, and that is the political import to the Trump coalition and the Republican majority in Congress of support from the manosphere and this culture-adjacent political wing. When you have the ostensible leader of that cultural adjacent movement saying we can, quote, change who we vote for next time, and explaining the nature of a child sex trafficking ring on the air, which was, you've got Ghislaine Maxwell in prison, but there are people she trafficked too, making the very logical point that to be in prison for felony child sex trafficking, and I think there are 4 other convictions, conspiracy to commit child sex trafficking and whatnot, you had to have been trafficking children for sex to people. And so his point is simple and not really one to be argued with, because she wouldn't be sitting in prison if she hadn't trafficked girls for sex to people. So where do you think this political crisis for Donald Trump stands today?
So I think that it stands in a hiatus until Congress returns, and then there will be a critical pivot point, as you suggest. The fact is that the Republicans in the House almost certainly are going to have to vote on whether to release the Epstein files. Now, the jujitsu that's starting to play out, you can just already see it, is that the Justice Department is going to selectively send some records to the House committee. Comer is then going to selectively release only some of those records. And I promise you, none of them will include the name Donald Trump. And so they will preemptively say, look, we did the thing that we said we were going to do. Democrats will call it out and say that is not true. And then the question is, where does the politics fall? Does the Trump coalition just say, okay, that's good enough? Or, as I suspect is the case, they say, no, we actually really want all the Epstein files. Like we didn't come this far to just have some of them. And that's where I just think like they have misread the politics of this all along. People may not understand all the nuance of policy. They may not really understand how Medicaid cuts affect them this year versus next year. They may not understand who is telling the truth and not telling the truth about tax cuts. They understand what it means that there was a child sex trafficker in the name of Jeffrey Epstein, that Donald Trump's campaign promised to release those files, that Donald Trump has a reason, some really good reason personal to him, that he doesn't want them released, and that the Republican Party is doing his bidding. That's not a complicated story for people. And so I think ultimately the politics cut in favor of these files having to be released, but I think the question is going to be the way in which the Department of Justice slow walks or selectively releases.
Mary, today's ruling by Judge Berman, nothing short of extraordinary. The judge writing, quote, there is another compelling reason not to unseal the Epstein grand jury materials at this time, namely possible threats to victim safety and privacy. Victims did not have sufficient notice before the government filed the instant motions to unseal. A nod and I think a recentering around the truest part of the story, that the real victims are girls, now women, who were sexually assaulted at the hands of Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. Your thoughts on the language that the judge uses today?
So to that point, I'm so glad you've uplifted that, Nicole, because one of the things that bothers me so much about this entire scandal, totally of the Trump administration's own making, when you spin conspiracy theories and then you cannot deliver, they're going to come back on you because now it looks like a cover up. But with all of that swirl, I feel like we don't talk often enough about how many victims, child victims, there were of this. You know, I prosecuted sex crimes in the District of Columbia, including child sex crimes. And these are some of the most heinous crimes out there. And people like Ghislaine Maxwell, who enable and traffic to someone, as Joe Rogan said, I mean, they are an integral part of these types of sex trafficking rings. There aren't tons and tons and tons of them, but they exist. And here, of course, we're talking about somebody who had such wealth, such power, such ability, Jeffrey Epstein, to make a convincing case through Ghislaine Maxwell that these girls ought to come and engage in sexualized massages, etc. That is that same sort of power dynamic that you see over and over and over in these types of cases. So I'm really, really glad you uplifted that, and I'm glad that the judge today pointed it out. The other thing I think that is remarkable here is Judge Berman, of course, is not the first judge to basically call out the not lies, but misrepresentations in the Department of Justice's own pleadings seeking to unseal these grand jury transcripts. Judge Paul Engelmeyer, just a few weeks ago, did the same thing, denied the Department of Justice's motion to unseal the transcripts from the Ghislaine Maxwell grand jury and said that the government's representations that these transcripts would be revealing of information that is of significant public interest were, and this is a quote, demonstrably false, which means I guess I was okay saying a lie,
Yes.
demonstrably false, right? And he says, anybody who actually reads these would see that there is no new information there. And the government, of course, knew that. And the government, when it first filed its motion to unseal, had not even included the transcripts. Judge Engelmeyer then asked for them, looked at them, and said, this was not an investigatory grand jury. It did not hear from victims. It did not hear from witnesses. It heard from a single FBI agent who gave summary testimony about what the investigation had shown. The Department of Justice knew that when it went into court and sought to unseal those. This was what both Judge Engelmeyer and Judge Berman said. This was a diversion to try to blame on the courts the lack of information coming out to the public.